When I arrived at my uncle's house, the air already felt heavy, like it carried too many memories for one place to hold. The small, weathered home sat at the end of a quiet road, framed by overgrown hedges and the hum of distant cicadas. I hadn't seen Uncle Marcus in years, not since his divorce, and though my mother had called it helping him out, it felt more like I was being sent somewhere to disappear that he greeted me at the door with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His hair had gone gray at the edges, his once sharp posture softened by years of quiet living. The smell of coffee and old books drifted through the hall behind him. "It's good of you to come," he said, his voice low, as if he wasn't used to speaking much anymore. I nodded, unsure what to say. The first few days slipped by quietly. Marcus worked from home, usually behind the closed door of his small office. I found him there one evening, surrounded by papers and a single desk lamp. He looked up when I knocked, eyes distant but kind. "You can come in," he said. "I don't bite." The words carried a faint trace of humor, and I smiled before retreating again. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper. The walls were lined with photographs, Marcus and a woman I recognized as Olivia, his ex-wife. Their smiles were perfect, but I could see the tension in them now, the kind that only time can reveal. Sometimes, I caught Marcus looking at those photos longer than he meant to, as if trying to remember who he had been back then. At dinner, we ate mostly in silence. He wasn't unkind, just distant, cautious with words. I filled the space by talking about school, about how I hadn't finished yet, about not knowing what came next. He listened without judgment. "There's no rush to figure it out," he said one night, cutting his food slowly. "Life takes more time than anyone expects." I started noticing small things about him, the way he always made 2 cups of coffee in the morning, though he only drank one, how he stood by the window at dusk, watching the light fade as if waiting for someone to appear. When I asked about his work, he shrugged. "Consulting," he said, though the word sounded like a placeholder. His hands were restless, always fidgeting with something, a pen, his ring finger, the corner of a napkin. There was a sadness about him that didn't announce itself, but lived in the pauses between words. And maybe that's what drew me in. Not pity, but recognition. I knew what it felt like to be unseen, to fill silence with thoughts that no one else could hear. One afternoon, rain began to fall, soft at first and then steady. Marcus was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, washing dishes. I offered to help, and he handed me a towel. For a while, we worked quietly. The only sounds were the rain and the clink of plates. Then, without looking up, he said, "It's strange, having someone here again." I forgot what that felt like. His words lingered. I wanted to respond, but all I managed was a small nod. The moment wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried something unspoken, like we both knew there was more to say, yet neither dared to open that door. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The rain on the roof, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the quiet echo of footsteps from down the hall. Sometimes, I thought I heard him pacing, stopping outside my room for a second before moving on. Maybe I imagined it. Or maybe he, too, was struggling with the weight of the quiet. As the days turned into weeks, our routines began to merge. He'd leave the front door unlocked for me when I came back from the store. I'd start dinner before he finished work. Little things. Domestic, ordinary. Yet, each act carried an intimacy that neither of us spoke about. One evening, he came home early from town. I found him sitting in the dim living room, the record player spinning a slow, crackling tune. He looked up as I entered, gesturing for me to sit. "Do you like jazz?" he asked. I didn't, not really, but I told him I did. We sat there for a long while, listening. The light from the lamp painted his face in soft gold. For the first time, he didn't look lonely. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. I caught myself staring, at the curve of his jaw, the stillness in his posture, the quiet way he existed in the space. When he glanced at me, I looked away too quickly, pretending to study the record sleeve. My chest felt tight, though I couldn't explain why. Later that night, as I was cleaning up, I found a letter half buried beneath a pile of magazines on the coffee table. It was addressed to Olivia but never mailed. I didn't read it, though I wanted to. The envelope was worn, the edges soft from being handled too many times. When Marcus came in, I placed it back quietly. He noticed, his eyes flicking to mine for a brief second, then away. "Some things are better left unopened," he said. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching dust in the air like glitter. Marcus sat with his coffee, eyes closed, as if trying to remember how warmth felt. I joined him at the table. "You know," he said, opening his eyes, "I used to think being alone meant being safe. Now I'm not so sure." I didn't know what to answer, so I said nothing. But his words stayed with me all day. That evening, I fell asleep on the couch while reading. When I woke up, the lights were off, and a blanket had been draped over me. I heard the soft click of a door closing down the hall. My heart beat faster than it should have. I wanted to thank him, but I stayed still, eyes half open, pretending to sleep. In the faint glow of the hallway light, Marcus paused for a moment, watching me. His silhouette looked tired, uncertain, and something about it made my chest ache. Then he turned away, and his footsteps faded into silence. The house seemed to breathe again, slowly, like it had accepted something between us that neither of us had spoken aloud. Outside, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic, washing over the quiet as if it understood what we could not yet say, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't feel like a guest anymore. I felt like I belonged to the quiet, to the stillness of this strange home, and, perhaps, to the man who lived inside it. The first chill of autumn settled over the house, bringing with it a silence that felt heavier than before. The trees outside had begun to turn copper and gold, their reflections glimmering faintly on the rain-slick windows. Inside, the days followed a rhythm that neither of us had to speak aloud. Marcus worked. I cooked. We shared space like two people drifting in the same tide, sometimes close, sometimes apart, but always aware of the other's presence. One morning, I found him on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the fog roll over the field beyond the yard. His hair was damp from the mist, and he didn't notice me at first. When he finally looked over his shoulder, his expression softened in that restrained way of his. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "Too quiet." He smiled faintly. "You get used to it." But the way he said it, low, almost tender, made me wonder if he ever had. We sat there without speaking, the kind of silence that feels shared rather than empty. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A train passed miles away, its horn low and mournful. Marcus finished his coffee and set the cup beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When Olivia left," he said, "I thought it would be temporary. That she'd come back once the noise settled. I kept the house ready for her. Even the spare toothbrush. I wasn't sure why he told me that, but I felt the weight of it, the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see." "Did she ever call?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "No. And maybe that's what I deserved. Something in me wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but I only nodded. The moment felt too fragile for words. That evening, I made dinner, roast chicken and potatoes, and for the first time, Marcus joined me in the kitchen instead of retreating to his study. We worked side by side, brushing shoulders now and then. The small touches shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. They lingered. When we sat down to eat, his laughter came more easily, and I realized I hadn't heard that sound in weeks. After dinner, we opened a bottle of wine. It wasn't planned, he just pulled it from a cabinet and said, "We might as well celebrate the fact that I didn't burn the kitchen." His humor was dry but warm, and I found myself laughing too. The wine loosened our words, and soon the conversation slipped from light to intimate. He asked about my life, what I wanted, what I feared, who I missed. I told him I didn't really know anymore. Marcus listened like every word mattered. "You remind me of myself," he said, swirling his glass. "Back when I still believed time could fix anything." The music from the old record player filled the pauses between us. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, steady and soft. I noticed his hand resting on the table, fingers tracing the rim of the glass. I didn't mean to stare, but I did. He noticed. Our eyes met for one suspended second, the kind that seems to last longer than it should. Then he looked away, clearing his throat, as if the air had suddenly grown too thin. The next morning, something between us had shifted. He was quieter than usual, yet not distant, more aware, maybe. When he passed me a plate at breakfast, our fingers touched, and neither of us moved right away. It was brief, but the hesitation said enough. Later, as he left for errands, he paused at the door. "You don't have to stay in all day," he said. "Go out. Breathe. Don't let this house swallow you the way it did me." His tone carried a hint of regret, though for what, I couldn't tell. That I spent that afternoon cleaning the porch, pretending the task had purpose. Every corner of the house smelled faintly of him: cedar, coffee, rain. When he returned, the light was fading, and the air had cooled. He looked tired, almost drained, but when our eyes met, his expression softened again. "You made this place look alive," he said, voice rough from the cold. "I'm trying," I said. "You're doing more than that." He hesitated, then added, "You make the days easier." The words hung in the air, too close to something neither of us was ready to name. That night, we sat in the living room again. The record spun slow jazz, the kind of music that fills silence rather than breaks it. He poured himself a drink, then one for me. I hesitated, but he said, "Just one. It helps you sleep." We talked for a while, about his childhood, about how he and my mother used to argue as kids. There was laughter, genuine and rare. Then the laughter faded, replaced by a stillness that felt both safe and dangerous. That he stared into the glass in his hand. "You ever wish you could start over?" "All the time," I said. His eyes met mine, steady and unreadable. "And if you did, what would you change?" I thought about it, then answered, "Maybe I'd learn to leave before things get complicated." He exhaled softly, almost like a laugh, but it wasn't one. "You say that like you already know it's too late." The room went quiet. The only sound was the record's soft static. He reached out, hesitating before his fingers brushed my wrist. It wasn't bold, just a quiet, searching touch, the kind that asks a question without words. My breath caught. Neither of us moved. The moment felt suspended, fragile, impossible. Then he pulled back suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm sorry," he murmured. That was wrong. I stood too, my pulse loud in my ears. "You don't have to apologize." But he shook his head, already turning away. "I do." His voice cracked, barely audible. "You should go to bed." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. So I nodded and left the room. That I in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. Through the thin walls, I could hear his footsteps pacing in the hallway, then stopping outside my door. For a long moment, there was silence. I could almost feel him standing there, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the soft sound of retreating steps. The creak of his bedroom door. And finally, nothing. That I lay down, eyes open in the dark, listening to the house breathe around us. The rain started again, slow and steady. It tapped gently against the window, as though reminding me that every quiet night in this house carried an echo, something unnamed, something we both felt but refused to claim. And as the storm deepened, I understood with an uneasy certainty that whatever line had separated us was already beginning to blur. Days passed without either of us mentioning that night. The air between us felt altered, dense with something fragile neither dared to touch. Marcus moved through the house like a man trying not to disturb dust, careful, deliberate, distant. I told myself to leave, to pack my things before silence turned into something harder to escape. But each morning when I looked at him across the kitchen table, the decision dissolved into hesitation. October light slanted through the windows, gold and cool. The season seemed to deepen everything, the shadows, the quiet, the weight of unspoken things. Marcus spoke less now, yet his presence filled every room. When I heard him playing the piano late at night, slow and hesitant, I'd stand at my door listening, afraid to break the fragile peace that music brought him. One afternoon, while stacking firewood near the porch, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A silver car pulled into the drive. A woman stepped out, elegant, sharp-featured, her coat cinched tight against the wind. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Olivia," he said, her name like a breath he'd held too long that I stood frozen, unsure whether to retreat or greet her. She glanced at me with polite confusion, then back at Marcus. "You didn't tell me you had company." "He's my nephew," Marcus said quickly. "Ethan." Olivia smiled faintly. "Ah. The helper your sister mentioned." Her tone was cordial but cool, the way people speak when they're standing on old, broken ground. Marcus invited her in, and I followed only far enough to hear their voices drift from the living room. Fragments carried through the hallway, words like papers, final, and closure. The conversation was formal, but beneath it ran a tension that vibrated like a low chord in the air. When she left an hour later, Marcus stood at the window long after her car disappeared down the road. "She looks the same," he said quietly. "Even her perfume. It's strange how memory hides in scent." I said nothing. He turned toward me then, and for a moment, I saw the man he must have been before loneliness took root, a man who had loved deeply and lost too much. That night, he poured himself a drink, something he rarely did. The house was dim, the fire flickering low. I sat across from him, feeling the pull of his silence. "Did you love her?" I asked, before I could stop myself. That he stared into the glass. "Yes," he said finally. "And no. I loved what I thought she was, the idea of being saved." "Do you still want her back?" He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. "I don't know what I want anymore." His voice broke slightly, and in that moment, the distance between us vanished. That he reached out, almost instinctively, as though drawn by something beyond choice. His hand brushed mine, gentle, uncertain, and I didn't move away. The room seemed to shrink around us, filled with breath and hesitation. He whispered, "You should hate me for this." I shook my head, though I didn't trust my voice enough to speak. The silence between us deepened until it felt like confession. Then, just as suddenly, he stood, retreating into shadow. "Go to bed, Ethan. Please." I went, but sleep refused to come. I heard him pacing again, the same rhythm as before, 3 steps, pause, turn. The sound was almost comforting, even as it hurt. The next morning, the house felt different. He'd left early, no note, no sign of where he'd gone. I spent the day waiting for the sound of his truck, for anything to break the stillness. When he finally returned near dusk, his expression was pale and drawn. "Olivia's moving to another state," he said flatly. "She wanted me to sign the last of the settlement papers." He rubbed his temples, exhausted. "It's done now." "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt small and useless. That he gave a faint smile. "Don't be. Some endings are overdue." We ate dinner quietly, both aware of something shifting again. When the dishes were cleared, he lingered near the sink, eyes unfocused. "You remind me of what I used to feel," he said softly. "Before everything dulled." I didn't know how to respond. My chest ached with things I couldn't say. "Maybe it's not too late," I offered, though I wasn't sure what I meant, for him, or for us. That he looked at me then, really looked. His expression was unreadable, torn between need and guilt. "You should go back soon," he said finally. "You've done enough here." The words struck harder than they should have. "If you want me gone, just say it." He closed his eyes. "That's not what I meant." "Then what do you mean?" His answer came after a long silence. "That I care too much to let this become something it shouldn't." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it already had, but the exhaustion in his face stopped me. Instead, I nodded, pretending to understand. Later, when the house was dark, I packed my bag quietly. I left the light off, moving by memory. The night outside was calm, the wind soft through the trees. As I walked down the hall, I paused at his door. It was open just enough to see him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. For a moment, I almost stepped inside. But then he looked up, and our eyes met through the dimness. No words passed between us. He gave the smallest nod, part farewell, part surrender, and I turned away. In the morning, the house was still. I left a note on the kitchen table, written in the space between heartbeats, "You weren't alone, Marcus." Neither was I. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and rain. The sun was rising behind the trees, thin and pale, cutting through the mist. I walked down the road without looking back, though I could feel his presence in every sound, the creak of the porch, the echo of the door closing behind me. As I reached the curve of the hill, I imagined him finding the note, standing in that kitchen with the morning light on his face. Maybe he'd smile. Maybe he wouldn't. But I knew, somehow, that both of us would carry that silence forward, the kind that lingers not from regret, but from something real that couldn't survive the world outside those walls. The wind rose, scattering leaves across the road like fragments of memory. I didn't stop walking. Some part of me hoped that, in another life, things might have been different. But in this one, leaving was the only way to keep what we'd had from breaking completely. Behind me, the house disappeared into the fog. Ahead, the road opened wide and empty, stretching toward a future I wasn't ready for, but one I had no choice but to face.